First of all, Justin, very, very warm welcome to you. A fellow RUSI, an expert in the field of air power. An absolute delight to chat to you today. We get straight into it. Literally, the most recent thing that's happened is Israel conducted a massive air power attack against Iran. As an air power guy, a former fighter pilot myself, I thought, how is this going to work? How are they're going to use missiles, not jets? In the event, it appears like three waves of jets, and it appears, despite having a fairly effective Russian air defense system involved, S-300, that, as my recollection is, all the jets came back in one piece, no sign of damage. How on earth did Israel manage to pull that off?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly an impressive demonstration. I should caveat anything said from here on out that I haven't seen the Cameo packages that they used. And so, how did they pull it off? I would love to know in more detail. But looking at the assets that they have to play with, one can make some probably reasonably solid assumptions. Firstly, being that they have leveraged three key components that they have, one of which is a significant force of F-15s, both sort of air superiority configured and strike configured, although in the Israeli case, all of them do both. But specifically, some of their, I believe they're called BAS variants, are specifically configured with SATCOM arrays, very significant data link suites, and use the rear cockpit of these, they're twin-seaters, use the rear cockpit specifically to help coordinate strike packages to provide a kind of mission commander function within Cameos at reach. Clearly, Israel doesn't have the scale of big wing enablers that you would expect to see in a US-led package. So I'm sure those were heavily involved, and of course, an F-15 with conformal fuel tanks and two or maybe even three under external fuel tanks has a very, very significant range. So again, helpful for that kind of distance, and no doubt a cool part of the strike. And also notably able to carry very heavy loads. So things like not just the smaller Rampage air-launched ballistic missiles, but also potentially, I believe it's called the ROCs, but the significantly larger ballistic missiles, one of which appears to have fallen, presumably from a failure on launch in Iraq, and appeared in pictures in Iraq, what looks like a ROCs. So that being the second kind of elements, standoff missiles to give an ability to reach targets that are defended, so aeroballistic, pretty fast, difficult to intercept, so able to go against defended targets with rapid response times from a reasonable standoff range. And then the third element is almost certainly F-35s. So the ability to be a bit closer to the threat because of that low observability. Also pretty good range on internal fuel, particularly for those really long missions, the benefit of being slick. So carrying all your fuel and weapons internally mounts up the longer you fly because you're taking less and less time in parasitic drag over time.
I guess part of where I'm going with this, though, mindful that your time is precious, that it's one thing having the attack package, it's quite another, actually. How do you open the door to allow the attack package in? I've heard you talk about things like seed and deed, suppression of enemy air, destruction of enemy air. These S-300s, when I was flying, these things were pretty scary. And yet it appears, I think the Iranians have four systems, one of which was apparently destroyed a while ago. And by all accounts, the other three have now been destroyed. That's a really effective break the door down. In other words, then leave you very vulnerable. That seems pretty impressive for the Israelis. That's a dangerous task.
It is. I mean, there's a few caveats there. So first of all, the Iranians have a lot of territory to cover with four firing units, four firing units, so a division in Russian terms, or a battalion, we would say generally. So what's probably been struck are particularly the radar sets. You'll still have quite a lot of TELs and maybe command vehicles. We don't know if those have been hit. But the Iranians are having to cover quite a lot of territory from multiple different potential axes of attack. They're worried about attacks from Israel, worried about attacks from America and from the Gulf, potentially even the Gulf states. And so compared to a Russian or a Chinese IADS in kind of key contested territories like Kaliningrad or the Taiwan Strait, you're probably looking at a significantly less dense ground-based laydown. Very little in the way of air-to-air capabilities as well. The Iranian Air Force really not capable of putting up much resistance in its current form. But yeah, as you say, it's still very impressive. And no doubt there was a combination of stand-in electronic attack effects. So F-35 is not just stealthy, it's also a very capable electronic attack platform in a stand-in and self-protection role. It wouldn't be a stretch to imagine that it is probably pretty damn capable against S-300 variants, because that really is the threat system family against which the F-35 was originally spec'd and designed. So, in some ways, this is probably a very well executed example of tech doing exactly what it was designed to do with an Israeli ConOps that also requires power projection over distance through multiple different countries' airspace that are not necessarily likely to intervene, but for different reasons in the case of both Iraq and Syria. But at the same time, you have to plan against the contingency. But also with the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to use those standoff air launch ballistic missiles as an effector. So you're not necessarily having to break the door in quite as comprehensively or at as much of a stand-in distance as you might have to if you were relying on more traditional weapons for the actual kinetic strikes.
But when I look back to my career in the military, and also the way we're supporting the Ukrainians, is that technology is our asymmetric advantage. And the danger is once you use it once, your enemy can then study what it can do. And it does feel, therefore, that the Joint Strike Fighter is a relatively new platform. The techniques that we've got to combat S-300, once you've done it once, and the Iranians now feel vulnerable, that means that they'll know what to put right to try and get themselves sorted. And why this links back, I guess the point of my question is that the Russians make a lot of money out of selling, defense exports and how they're really good, really effective. It doesn't look like they were that effective at all. Now, is that because the S-300 is just an old model? Is it because the S-400 is out and about now? Is it because actually Russians don't have that much effective kit? And will that actually impact their export capability? Because it's one thing buying this stuff. If it doesn't work, it's a really expensive chocolate fireguard, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is not something that's likely to please Almazanti, the manufacturer of the S300 and S400 series, of which there are actually two very distinct variants that used to be different design bureaus, although they're now all together in Almazanti. So the Iranian systems, I believe, are PMU2 systems, so they're sort of in the mid-range of S300 capabilities. So I say SA20, I believe, would be the NATO designation, as opposed to the older SA10s, so PS, PT, but not quite S300, which would have been PMU3, or S300V4, which would be SA23. So in some ways, the Russians may well be, and the Iranians may well be getting some interesting data from this strike, particularly if the F-35s were indeed involved using some of that stand-in electronic attack capability. On the other hand, the same goes the other way. So this would be, as far as I'm aware, the first time that F-35s have kinetically gone against actual S-300s in an actual shooting context. And so in that sense, the data coming off those F-35s, which every aircraft is an ELINT soak in itself, will be extremely valuable going the other way, not just to Israel, but also to the United States, and thence, if it makes its way through updated mission data files, probably to other partners as well. So that there is then probably a kind of race for both sides to see who can leverage quickest and best. And in both cases, the argument could also be made that they're not necessarily the representative versions of the system. The Israelis, for example, are the only nation that has its own very distinct variant of the F-35, which looks similar, but they have pretty significant rights to modify their software and their mission data. But that also cuts them off from some of the sort of Five Eyes type mission data files. So this, by the same token, the Russians are probably not going to have supplied the Iranians with the exact variants of the radar and the exact waveforms and war modes that they would be using. which incidentally we've got a pretty good look at from Ukraine in the West. So I think at the moment, the balance of advantage from lessons learned in technical terms is probably on the Western side. But stand fast, both sides learn. And of course, just because you have the opportunity to learn more doesn't necessarily mean you exploit that opportunity. It's one of the things I think that will really define an ever increasing amount of air capabilities going forward relative to threats is actually the mission data update rate that goes into everything from electronic warfare systems, defensive aid suites, weapon, ECCM, all of those sort of things. Because one of the results of the war in Ukraine going the way it has is that both Russia and Ukraine are constantly in this ever accelerating cycle of innovation and counter innovation, particularly in the UAV and counter UAV innovation space for EW systems.
We've watched, strike and counter strike over many years, Iran and Israel sort of trading blows. This one feels just completely different because, in effect, rather than throwing missiles, which has no people on board, that's what Iran did, and some of them get through. It appears that this was putting manned aircraft across, busting a hole, basically saying, you can't protect your country. In fact, we've probably taken out part of the best systems that you've got. We all came home, and actually now you are even more exposed. What does that say strategically about Iran's military capability?
Well, I think it does certainly point to the weakness in a lot of Iran's current conventional posture. And it's certainly notable that one of the features of both the Israeli war against Hezbollah and also the last few cycles of tit-for-tat escalation between Iran and Israel directly is that Israel has shown a much greater risk appetite than I think anybody predicted. Stand fast, of course, October 7th last year, which led directly into the Gaza side of things. But I think specifically against Hezbollah and against Iran, Israel has really shown itself willing to cross a lot of what were previously mutually understood red lines of that would cause much greater escalation were just too risky. So, going after the leadership of Hezbollah, lock, stock, full scale exposure and activation of essentially penetrations into their network, and the same with Iran. So first of all, striking an Iranian defense site in response to the first barrage back in April, and then of course this strike, which was much larger. And I think within that, Iran has certainly come off appearing much weaker than Israel, as both sides have kind of shown their hands. The flip side, of course, is that what we also saw was a relatively successful and very successful the first time and relatively successful the second time air and missile defense effort against those Iranian salvos. But at the same time, a lot more got through the second time. And we know even in open source that the burn rate of particularly the higher end Israeli Arrow 2 and 3 interceptors, as well as US Navy SM-6 and SM-3, was fairly unsustainably high. And Iran still has an enormous ballistic missile arsenal. So the way that the picture looks after a bit of back and forth, I don't think is necessarily entirely representative of how a full-scale war would go. And on the nuclear side, it's worth mentioning, despite Israel's demonstration of force here and capability of knocking in the door, they still don't actually have the capacity to kinetically destroy the Iranian nuclear program, especially given how close to breakout they are. Only the United States fields a weapon capable of actually penetrating a lot of those buried facilities with the B-2 and the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator. And even then, Iran has no doubt dispersed as much of the apparatus and particularly key personnel as they can during this period of high tension. And so there really isn't much way to actually destroy that nuclear breakout capability. The question is whether the Iranians see value and whether that balance changes depending on how vulnerable they currently feel, which it may do, in actually moving forward another step towards weaponization, given that up to now they seem to have been comfortable with holding in a position that everybody understood was fairly close to a rapid breakout posture, but without going any further.
There's so much more we can talk about that, but for now, let's shift gear across to Ukraine. I guess there's several things in Ukraine, particularly around the air power piece. What I would let's start off with is how far the West is prepared to get involved. Over the last couple of years, you and I, in various different forums, have talked about no-fly zones, and there's a very good reason why the West has not decided to do that. My question to you is more that with North Korea now being dragged in other words, it's becoming an international effort by Russia. Do you think that we are closer to the time when the West might consider putting a no-fly zone into the west of Ukraine, where there isn't a threat of using missiles to target Russian capability on Russian soil, but actually potentially helping Ukraine defend itself in the same way that America and the Allies were defending Israel?
So I think we're closer insofar as, well, there's been a steady erosion of what were previously considered unthinkable diplomatic no discussion positions, shall we say, over the past 3 years on both sides. I think we're still in a place where it would be very logistically difficult to actually make a no-fly zone work in Western Ukraine, even if we decided politically to do it. Partly because a lot of the threat in Western Ukraine is from either ballistic missiles or from one-way attack UAVs, neither of which NATO nations are particularly well set up to actually cover large areas with. If you look at ballistic, yes, we've got Patriot, yes, there's THAAD or other systems that could potentially be there. But those systems exist on the Western side in a context where the ammunition production capacity is mostly going to Ukraine already. And the demand for additional interceptors, particularly PAC-3 interceptors, around the world is so far exceeds the production capacity that just dedicating, say, additional Western launchers doesn't necessarily change the game hugely, because the limit is interceptors. And the risk that we would be taking by running down essentially emergency war stocks any further would be somewhat significant, given we would then be directly taking part in the conflict from a legal point of view. And so attacks coming back the other way, cruise missile or otherwise, would be more difficult to argue the posture against. And in terms of aircraft, if you're operating over Western Ukraine, there's various ways that Russia could potentially pose a threat to those aircraft that you either would have to accept the risk on, in terms of either systems positioned in Belarus, for example, or even Kaliningrad, depending on the altitudes you were flying at and where, patrols in the Black Sea, or systems in Crimea, depending on where you wanted to patrol. You'd also then be looking probably at a pretty high munitions expenditure rate for going after one-way attack UAVs with fighter aircraft, even if you were doing that. And as we've seen from repeated incidents recently where UAVs have crossed into Romania or Poland, generally by accident, not always from the Russian side. But it's notable that actually we don't have very good answers for how to intercept those, because the answers really that you want for those sort of systems are self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. That's the kind of efficient way, and manpads. And most of those that we have been sent to Ukraine. So
my understanding is that the way that the Ukrainian Air Force are operating at the moment is that they're no match for the Russians. Therefore, they tend to operate some way behind the front line. And my understanding is that a lot of them are operating in that sort of anti-missile, anti-drone modus operandi, because that's where they can add most value. And it feels like if they're doing that with a handful of jets, that feels like something that the West could potentially provide quite a lot of help with. And therefore, it's just, if you wind the clock back 2 years, and you and I were watching the start of this, and the West said, Ukraine's not a member of NATO, we can't get involved. Risk, and Putin's shaking that nuclear saber every step. But we went to anti-tank weapons, we went to tanks, then we went to long-range missiles. Now we're into providing F-16s. It just feels that if we could have wound the clock back, if we'd done some of this stuff earlier, would it have changed the outcome of the war? And if you take that approach, what are we going to decide to do in the next year or so? And therefore, why are we not doing it now? Airpower would seem to be, most of my colleagues are going, Russia's struggled against Ukraine. My goodness, would it struggle against a NATO airpower capability? So are we close to the day where we go, we can't let Putin win, and therefore, is that something that become more palatable?
I think part of it depends on how the situation on the ground goes. If you were to, for example, see a significant Ukrainian collapse, that's a very different then series of incentives and perceived risk calculi. And we've already seen statements from France, from Estonia, from Finland, and from others, essentially saying nothing's off the table in that context, up to and including troops in country. In terms of our ability to do so, would the Russians struggle against NATO air power? In the air, certainly. But I would, and this is particularly relevant given what's likely, what we're looking at as a question next week. I would distinguish between would they struggle against American air power or NATO air power led by America versus European coalition of the willing type air power, where yes, in the air-to-air sense, we'd be fine, but that's not where the primary threat comes from. If you look at the ability of relatively small air forces who have to cover an enormous number of mission sets with relatively limited flying hours and weapons budgets to resource the enablers and weapons across multiple domains and the targeting capacity to go and write down GBAD layers, which you would need to be prepared at least to do. Otherwise, the Russians, well, why not just engage you? You're taking part in the conflict. I think the list of countries that would need to be all in to do that gets quite long if you're not including the US doing the full heavy lifting. And even in the current administration, there has been a very obvious reticence to get involved in anything like that. And so I suspect if Vice President Harris wins next week, you will probably see a continuation, broadly speaking, of that policy, depending, responsive to the movements on the ground, obviously. If it goes the other way and you get a second Trump term, I think there's almost no chance of the US going that way. And so options, yeah, probably relatively constrained. And if you're looking at the mechanics of going in to do intercepting Shaheds and cruise missiles potentially with fighter aircraft for sorties not based in Ukraine, but going in and out, the deconfliction problems, if nothing else, are not small in terms of how you manage the deconfliction between your aircraft, which would need to be down at low level, hunting for things in and amongst a country covered with hundreds of mobile air defense teams with manpads and SPAGs and short-range SAMs, plus the large SAM network and the Ukrainian Air Force fighters themselves. It's a complex one, and I imagine the risk case would be interesting to look at, and the interception rates might not be hugely impressive for the cost and political capital you'd expend to get there. I think if we're serious about intervening in Ukraine directly in any way, really, it's sort of almost an all or nothing thing. Either you say, right, okay, this is now existential for us, we're getting involved, in which case you probably look at a full-on stabilization force of saying, right, we're looking to freeze the conflict, but this goes no further than this. We're willing to enforce it, and if you really want to fight over it, Russia, then fine, we're involved, with all of the escalation implications that come with it. But just dipping your toe in, I don't think we're going that way, unless, as I said, things start really collapsing, in which case you might see countries that have the risk tolerance and the clarity of vision around the threat going unilaterally or unilaterally in, like Poland, France, maybe the Baltic states.
But I would probably argue that we, in a way, we are, using your vernacular, we are dipping our toe in the water, because when the whole F-16 thing was talked about, certainly colleagues there was no intention of the F-16s joining the fight. It was, at the end of the war, Ukraine would need its own indigenous air power capability. The long pole in the tent was going to be pilots. Therefore, let's start training them now, because the aircraft can be supplied. It's more getting the pilots in. I understand, President Zelensky wailed rather loudly at that. So they said, okay, we'll push some of these F-16s to you. And that must have created some really interesting conversation. I don't want to get into the sensitivity of the secrecy, but inevitably it's about the standard of radar, the electronic warfare, the defensive aid suites, all of those other capabilities. And in a way, we through colleagues, I understand. I was out in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago for a week. I understand that actually many of their pilots, they don't have an air warfare center. They don't have so they are learning a bit as they go along. And yet most modern aircraft are heavily dependent on an air warfare center, intelligence-led, software-driven type capability. So it feels like we've dipped our toe in, but we're not really prepared to give them everything they need.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we're certainly involved in terms of provision of EW assistance, mission data assistance, training assistance. I mean, hell, supplying the munitions. But I think it's a bit like the fact that there is a very, very clear policy distinction drawn both in the West and in Russia, in the Kremlin, between Western long-range strike weapons being used to strike targets in occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea versus being used to strike targets in, say, Belgorod or Rostov. Even though, according to Russian law, they have said that those occupied territories are part of Russia, both sides understand perfectly clearly that there is a distinction between weapons use in the occupied territories versus actual Russia. And in the same way, I think actually both sides understand perfectly well where the red lines lie in terms of what is considered being a direct party to the conflict, as opposed to being an ally and essentially conducting proxy support. So in the same way, it's interesting you bring up the F-16. So for example, what is interesting is, to me at least, is that where you might have seen a much more direct step towards dipping the toe in, which would have been essentially Foreign Legion style, former Western aircrew going in as members of the Ukrainian armed forces, which there's Foreign Legion units on the ground side of things, and have been since the very start of the war, albeit none sanctioned by their countries of origin, respectively. The fact that that hasn't happened suggests to me that there is still, and despite the fact that it would have been hugely beneficial, because you're absolutely right, pilots are the absolute bottleneck as well as, of course, maintainers. I think they're actually, despite all of the kind of grey areas in the support realms, I think there's quite a lot of clarity on both sides on where the actual distinction lies on direct involvement or not. And as you'll know very well from a legal point of view, any aircraft which does something during flight, combat operations or whatever, the country from which the sortie departed is legally responsible for that sortie. So again, this thing of, well, why can't they operate from, say, bases in Poland and then go and do stuff in Ukraine and fly back? It's like, no, sorry, legally, that airbase is then a legal target for the Russians. And by the way, the country that licenses the flights or permits the flights and authorizes the flight plans is actually responsible for it. So again, the Russians bend the rules? Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting that they stopped actually flying out of Belarus quite quickly. They were initially, but they did stop doing so, and they've actually been relatively cautious about what they've then been doing from Belarus since. So even the Belarusians seem to be somewhat interested in controlling that direct side of things. But yeah, there's definitely a greater likelihood, I think, of direct Western involvement. because of the way things are going and the threats involved. But at the same time, I think there's still very, very strong policy reluctance. And the other question is, of course, Ukraine membership of NATO, which, it's intimately tied up with these questions, because the notion that just by saying Ukraine is a member of NATO, Russia would suddenly go, okay, fine, well, yeah, we give up on that. 600,000 plus casualties. All right, fine, we don't really care. You're a member of NATO now, hands off. In many ways, if we're not willing to fight on behalf of the Ukrainians as a co-belligerent against Russia, then we shouldn't be admitting them to NATO, because that's what that treaty says. And well, it says we will consider an attack on all of us. And so, there's almost a kind of put up or shut up bit of that. But this idea that somehow the talismanic international law bit that says, oh, now we'll consider an attack on all of us, that the Russians wouldn't call that bluff if they think it's completely incredible. Yeah, I see why there's skepticism in a lot of countries.
No, I get that, but I also think there's a time element here, isn't there, as well? I mean, even if this isn't an insurance policy, I joined the club, okay, here's your membership. There's a lot of, it is, everybody has to be involved in that club. You will have to contribute stuff. And also, I'm not entirely convinced at the moment that eventually the war will have to end. There'll probably be some sort of negotiated solution. If you put NATO membership of Ukraine as not on the table, it's already been done, it's a fait accompli, I think that's something that Putin would probably be very uncomfortable with. And therefore, the danger is you protract the war. Without getting into it now, the Budapest Memo in 1994, when I was out there, it was really interesting. The Ukrainians felt betrayed in a way, and therefore, they're obviously very thankful for the support the West is doing, but they're also going, you did guarantee our security.
Yeah. No, indeed. The issue being, of course, that one of the three countries guaranteeing the security is the one that's invaded them.
Yes.
Which, yeah, no, it's a difficult one.
Can we bounce? Mindful of the time available. One of the things I also want to get there's a lot of talk about, we're going through a defense review at the moment. There's a lot of talk about what lessons could be learned from Ukraine and, all of that sort of side. The first question I've got, which links to NATO, I guess, is that there's this sort of declaration of NATO first. And can I just tease you a little bit about that? Because as a military guy, it feels like we're saying that we can no longer afford to do this stuff ourselves. So we're now going to position ourselves under the NATO umbrella. And if you measure NATO by mass, then it's incredibly, it's a massive organization, a very credible organization. But the deterrent side, small d, means that you've got to make it work on the day. And with 32 countries now, we're already seeing not all those countries are aligned politically. Turkey has got its own views close. The danger is that if we put all our eggs in that basket and politically America distance itself a little bit more from that, doesn't that make us more vulnerable, not less? And therefore, is that headline policy popping out of actually finding a way of funding our own national capability?
So I must admit, I would interpret the NATO first messaging a bit differently. I think it's essentially saying Europe first, i.e., it is a theatre commitment. It's basically a rejection of the Indo-Pacific pivot in defense terms, without saying explicitly that it's a rejection of the Indo-Pacific pivot in defense terms. So I would interpret it, rather than saying we can't afford to defend ourselves nationally, therefore we have to go under the NATO umbrella, I would interpret it more as we can't afford to be a global full spectrum force and meet our obligations for collective defense under NATO in our own backyard. Therefore, it's the collective defense stuff that could be non-discretionary, i.e. the fight we might have to have that we didn't choose first. And once we've got that sorted out, or if we can get that sorted out, then we can look at other stuff. And so, if you take that at face value, and I think, to be honest, the budget situation is going to force us to take that at face value, there are a lot of things for which the British military is currently configured across the three services that you wouldn't choose to have done if your primary focus was on the non-discretionary potential threat in Europe and the North in our backyard. For example, most obviously, you would not have configured the entire Royal Navy around two carrier strike platforms with an idea to project power around the world. Instead, you would have focused it on anti-submarine warfare and mine countermeasures and protecting the deterrent in the North Sea and the North Atlantic, and if you could, up into the Barents, which was always the number one task number one task protecting the deterrent, number two task ASW in the GI UK gap and further north if you can, which is a very different force configured with much greater focus on frigates, submarines, and MCM rather than air defense destroyers, which sure have utility in an air defense in an air and missile defense context, provided you have interceptors for them in large quantities, which is an interesting assumption.
Mindful of the time, the way you're going, I absolutely agree with you. But in a way, if you knew where you were going, you wouldn't start here. But we are, because we've configured ourselves the last 30 years around wars of choice rather than wars of national survival. And mindful that, obviously you're the air power expert and I'm an air power interest, is that it feels like, given if we are more focused on the sort of European area, then we've had bad experience putting large land forces on the ground because we take casualties. We do have air and maritime power. Maritime power maybe not quite configured the right way. Therefore, mindful that we're very short of resources, where are the big plays, do you think, that the government should take on the air power side?
So I think fundamentally, if you look at the air mix we've got, it has a lot of the ingredients that you need already, because NATO context doesn't just mean fighting the Russians. It means finding the way the UK can add most value to the alliance's ability to defend itself in Europe. And so in that context, for example, Poland is buying 1,000 main battle tanks. Germany has hundreds and hundreds of main battle tanks. Finland has hundreds of battle tanks. So, Sweden's buying new ones. The Netherlands are buying new ones. There's already kind of big land forces there. So I agree that the focus is most likely to be in terms of where real UK value add for the money we have is probably most likely to be in the air and maritime domain. In the air forces, I think we probably have more lift than we need as a standing European NATO commitment, because our lift fleets were configured around enduring operations at Reach in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you would probably want to rebalance towards combat air and the weapons and EW enablement and mission data enablement that goes towards that. I think the biggest hole, most obvious hole in our air capabilities at the moment is just weapons. It is frankly absurd that we have a slowly growing but growing F-35 force and Typhoon, which is good for air-to-air and standoff. But neither of them have a weapon that is even remotely credible for SEAD-DEAD in a contested environment, which is the number one bottleneck for deterrence, not just air, but across the piece in Russia context in Europe. So, in classic British form, we have developed a fantastic answer for the problem, which is Spear 3 and Spear EW since 2010. And then we've slow rolled, because it was never the priority in year, the development and ordered them in such tiny quantities in the early phases that it's still not ready, although test firings and things are happening. And also, crucially, the cost per weapon is really high, which then leads to this circular problem of the cost per weapon is high, so the Treasury says we can't buy many of them in year. This means that the US Joint Program Office deprioritizes the weapon in the integration timeframes for F-35, because other nations are buying much more capable are buying weapons in much larger quantities among lots of nations. Norwegian Joint Strike Missile is an obvious thing that the US have now just bought as well. AARGM-ER is another one. Those have actually been integrated ahead of Spear 3 now, even though they are newer weapons, because more allies are buying them in large quantities. But that also then leads the MOD to go, well, the integration timeframe isn't until here, so we can avoid buying a load until this year because actually they won't be integrated, which leads to further slippage and.
There's also I mean, the trouble with this debate is that there's also a very powerful lobby in the UK that talks about platforms. You know, it's driven by some of the big primes that talk about Tempest or whatever. And I'm not here to talk about the rights and wrongs of it. It does seem strange that sometimes the conversations seem to be more focused around jobs and opportunity than military capability. And given that we are going to be very short of money, regardless of the 2.5%, given the nuclear deterrence coming out of the budget, huge swell, the actual amount of money being available is relatively small. If we put big bets on things like platforms, it feels like we're going to make the problem around weapons, as you're describing it, worse.
Yeah, I would say the current fairly obvious problem that the UK has in combat air terms, specifically relative to a lot of our equivalent or similar partners like the Australians, the Dutch, the Norwegians, is that we get far less out of our assets in terms of combat capability, not activity. We fly a lot more than a lot of them, but that actually is part of the problem. We sweat the assets, but actually that costs a lot. It means that high-end training is difficult to do because you're constantly busy in small packages all over the place. And it means that we just don't buy the weapons that stocks and the weapon types that other countries have got off their backsides on and ordered because the need is pretty clear. So yeah, I think there is a big issue there. And also in platform terms, the UK just has a horrible habit of basically biting off a lot more than it can chew in terms of ambition, partly because of that focus on jobs. So we make these big moonshot ideas, but then we don't have nearly enough funding to make them actually work, which means that we end up with something that isn't actually technically that competitive a lot of the time, or even if it is at the start, it's never updated and serviced properly. And so it quickly becomes obsolescent, which means that exports don't work out as well as we'd hoped. It means that the capability atrophies to a degree, and things in year constantly move on because we move right because we don't fund them properly, which means that we end up in a situation where, for example, Typhoon today, relative to Rafale, closest, most obvious competitor, is a shadow of what it was in relation to Rafale 10 years ago, when Typhoon was almost unarguably the more capable platform across most mission sets. Sorry, if you look at a Rafale in French service today and a Typhoon in UK service, the Rafale's the better platform. Because they've just kept that investment up in upgrading the mission systems, the EW, the weapons fit, the radar. And it shows. The same for American platforms. They just keep upgrading them. And in the UK, you see this now with GCAP, the opposition of the GCAP argument, essentially as to why we can't build out the F-35 force to what we know it needs to be to meet the defense obligations in both the maritime, the land, and the air. There's a lot of dependency on F-35 across the joint force because it's your best ISTAR asset, it's your penetrating strike asset, it's your, but instead it's, oh no, we can't really afford that, having pushed it right, because now we need GCAP, we need the next thing, the jobs depend on it. And at the same time, it always puzzles me, the argument that says, well, we'll do it for half the money and half the time. Well, the argument, I would say that the problem with that argument is you then also say it'll be tens of thousands of high-paid jobs. Okay, so who is paying for those high-paid jobs? Answer, the customer paying in, so the government paying in the money. So if your program is going to be half the money for half the time, then you will sustain either half the jobs for the same time or the same jobs for half the time. There's no way around that. And yeah, exports might help a bit, but there's a lot of competition there, especially if you're trying to not gold plate anything.
Turning this on its head then, but Justin, just turning this on its head for a minute, because obviously I don't want to prevail on time too much. The harsh reality, well, somebody once said, vision without funding is hallucination. It does feel like I was a warrior of the Cold War. We've enjoyed 30 years of peace. We dropped our budgets. We got rid of a whole load of stuff. Now it feels like a lot more dangerous world, but we're bankrupt as a country. And even if we went to 2.5%, which politically looks attractive, it's pretty bad. Justin is now king for the day. What are your three priorities, do you think, that you would focus on in the near and medium term for our country in the air power domain?
In the air domain, the three things I'd focus on up front would be 2 squadrons of F-35As dedicated to SEAD. So get rid of the inter-service squabbling there. Bs, you can do the carrier strike bit. That's that. You don't need to worry about cross-tasking. 2 squadrons of As with SEAD weaponry, either Spear 3, Joint Strike Missile, or AARGM-ER, but proper SEAD capabilities. We know how to operate the platform. I would extend the life of, just accept that we're extending the life of Typhoon, which we all know we're going to have to do anyway, to 2045 at least, which then means the business case is much easier to make to increase the buy for ECRS-2, the new radar, for not just the 40 Tranche 3s, but also the 77 Tranche 2s. The reason you can't do that at the moment is because the timeframes would take you close to the out of service date if you think it's 2040, which it isn't, but officially it is. So increase the investment into Typhoon midlife upgrade effectively with the new radar update to the DAS. And the third priority would be, and alongside, if you could do Spear 3 as opposed to AARGM-ER for your F-35s, also buy enough to put them on Typhoon to give them A, quicker introduction into service, B, we've already done the flight testing and integration for test firings because they're all being done on Typhoon. That would also allow you to try and solicit ways to make that in bulk with partners like Italy, Germany, who we've just signed a big agreement with, France for Offer Rafale. They need a SEAD weapon, they don't have one. It's a fairly obvious way to try and help, and Spear EW is crucial in that because you need EW to get your weapons through, not just to protect your platforms. F-35A, new radar for Typhoons, and just admit you're extending the life. So that's the fighters bit. Spear 3 and Spear EW is the main priority on air weapons, and the third priority would be expanding the E7 fleet, because you need E7 to do your integrated air and missile defense, both for the UK, where it's your primary sensor, trying to look for Russian KH-31 cruise missiles, which are still the main threat to UK bases. UK infrastructure is air-launched cruise missiles from the Arctic. And you need an AWACS sensor to give you that picture, to vector in fighters, to queue in ground defenses if we buy them. You really can't do that without that look. But also NATO is desperately short of AWACS capacity. E3 just doesn't give you that performance really against low observable cruise missiles. It's too old, the radar. So getting some E7s that we can tow to NATO to help fill in that picture, those gaps between the ground-based radar coverage, so that in the event of a war, you have a much better ability to vector fighters, to optimize air defense, which there are a lot of across NATO, but there's very few modern AWACS. So again, UK adding value there, both for ourselves and for NATO, to enhance air and missile defense, which would also enhance our ability to do the offense because it's a key situational awareness and potentially EW platform. Again, which we're already buying, but in that classic UK thing, we've selected the right platform, the right capability, but in desperately small numbers that are inadequate. And if to pay for that, you had to make significant cuts elsewhere. New medium helicopter, sorry, is an obvious one. We have a lot of helicopters for a nation that's not doing an enduring land commitment. Probably reduce the size of the Chinook fleet somewhat. You need some SF Chinook support, and some Chinook is always good, but it's very expensive. And a fleet of 60, if we go back up to that, seems a bit excessive given the cost. If you're having to make, otherwise you're not able to make the investments you need in combat air. And to be honest, if that means that you can't do GCAP, sorry, but ultimately combat air exists to defend the nation. And if you can't make combat air capable of defending against the non-discretionary threat, i.e. give it the weapons, give it the sensor upgrades, and give it the flying hours to train properly and actually operate, then why are you throwing huge amounts of money at the next thing? The argument that says this is something that will pay back lots of additional benefit beyond what you invest into it is true, but it's not true in the exclusion of anything else. So if you pour money into HS2 or the health service or whatever, that also brings back significant money back into the economy. Government spending stimulates the economy in general. So it's not as stark as that picture is often portrayed. I still think we should do GCAP if we can, i.e. if money is no object and we're just going to borrow and treat it as a national investment in STEM and in industrial capacity, as France, for example, does. It funds R&D for fighter programs not from the main Ministry of Defense budget. It treats it as a national, strategic economic policy. Fine, I would love to see that. But we need to plug the gaps in our own defense first. Because if NATO can't do it as a whole, without the US if they're involved in the Indo-Pacific or politically disconnected. And we're saying we can't afford to do it. Who is going to do it? We're supposed to be the second military force in NATO, as we tell ourselves all the time, although nobody else really thinks of us really as that anymore, at least not in any individual area. C2 and targeting, we still have some really good capabilities, but you know, the say-do gap is already rather large for the UK in NATO and broadly in military terms. So I think we really need to narrow down our focus of number of mission sets we look at and focus on doing some really cool things well, where our USPs are, where we can add the most value to the alliance, and that is air and maritime.
So my final question to you, I think, is more that you and I, the danger is we operate in an echo chamber. I was listening to some of the acronyms that are coming out, and but actually in this country, defence is always a very low priority, and when it comes to funding and the like, and we don't seem to have found a way to make a positive case for it. And for our politicians, my worry is that they look in 5-year terms, probably less than that. And if you look at the threat from Russia, we could discuss it, we don't have time, but it probably falls outside the 5-year term to be a direct threat to Europe. To be discussed, I grant you, but there are a lot of people talking about 7 years or whatever. So the danger is it just keeps getting parked. How do we ensure that this debate about our national sovereignty, our defensive capability, which should be a number one priority of every government, how do we make sure it gets better understood by the general public who probably don't understand the nuances of GBAD, CAD, all of this sort of stuff? How do we make it more relevant?
So I think there's two key elements. One is being much more upfront with the public about the threat, because, and I don't think I'm being pessimistic at all, actually, in saying that it is, I would say, 2 to 4 year horizon for Russia potentially being a serious threat to European security within a NATO context. Depends on the US posture, and if the US is in a position where it's not facing a concurrent problem in the Indo-Pacific and it remains politically engaged in NATO, then I don't think we have a problem in those timeframes. But there's plenty of scenarios where that's not the case. And if the US is engaged, particularly in something over Taiwan or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, Russia would only have to be in a frozen conflict, or, by the way, having potentially won in Ukraine for a year or two, to have a massive stockpile and a lot of very battle-hardened troops and a lot of recent combat experience at scale, relative to Europe, where our build-up is really slow in comparison. Russia is only full war economy, and that isn't going away. Even if the Ukraine conflict gets frozen, they will continue that build-up. And so we could be in a pretty difficult position pretty quickly. It's not that they're going to try and invade an entire country, but taking a bit of NATO territory to show that if Article 5 is called, we can't do anything about it, is all they need to do to essentially destroy NATO as a functioning pillar of European security. After which, my goodness, if we think we can't afford our defensive needs now, imagine that. So I think the need is quite urgent. I think we've mostly got the tools to deal with it if we prioritize, because if we can roll back Russian air defenses as the most capable European powers with maybe a bit of US support, I don't think the Russians will risk anything, because they know that they can't stand up to TAC air if we can knock the door in. But in terms of making the public case, first of all, be more honest about the threat. You see this much more in some other countries, with statements by Norwegian Ministry of Defense recently, Chief of Defense recently. We have 3 years to prepare for war with Russia. You had German Minister of Defense Oscar Pistorius talking about the need to reintroduce conscription because they might have a war within 5 years. Incidentally, he's the most popular politician in Germany by a long way, which is notable, given what you would instinctively perhaps expect from those sort of statements. The Scandinavian nations, the Baltic states, don't worry, they get it. And the second thing, though, is to be more honest about the gaps, because the real problem, I think, is in the whole argument of there's no votes for defense, is because, at least in my experience talking to ordinary people with ordinary jobs and ordinary outlooks, is they think everything's basically fine. And they assume that because they assume that if it wasn't, the government will be doing something about it. And so there is this element of it can't be as serious. The military just always says they need more stuff. But if it was really serious, then obviously the government would be fixing it. And so the kind and it's not helped by defense's instinct, and particularly for those whose job it is to kind of try and make the helpful criticisms, to shed some light on where there are gaps. It doesn't help that usually the media response from the MOD or the departments is, we don't recognize these findings. We stand fully ready to meet all of our NATO commitments and defend the UK. And you know, particularly the Chief of Defence Staff saying there's no danger from Russia. NATO is completely safe. Okay, well, if that's the case, then you don't need any more money and you don't need any reforms. And fine, if everything's fine, then crack on.
That's the one thing that has always irritated me, because you know when I joined the military, we had some, I think, 5 4-stars in the Royal Air Force, and some of those were really scary individuals, and they would bark at politicians if they looked the wrong way. They were very robust in how they handled politicians, and would absolutely call it as they see it. Today, when you have one 4-star and he feels more like a political appointee, he has to be very careful about how he voices his concerns, both in private, but particularly in public. And I know only too well, working in the media now quite a lot, you know, the MOD is not allowed to talk. The serving are not allowed to talk to the media. So they're not allowed to have that voice. And it's very closely politically controlled. And if the politics don't want to spend money on that because they want to spend more money on defense, because the public feels the impact of that, they want to have appointments, they can't get them. They feel the impact of gas prices. They don't feel the impact of defense. They rely on the seniors, but the seniors aren't allowed to talk. I just don't see how you unlock that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the messages to try and emphasize, I guess, probably more in private than in public, but on the political side is, there are many, many things that the public will both fairly and unfairly judge any government on its ability to fix, and all of them require, or almost all of them require money. They all could become a hot topic at the next election, and we might look one way or other at the next election. Although if any government had an opportunity to make bold changes as needed, probably the first year of a 5-year parliament with a stonking majority is about the best time to make serious decisions, because they can be unpopular. It doesn't really matter. You've got 5 years until to hopefully show why they were the right decisions. But the one of the few things that can pretty much absolutely guarantee you a loss at the next election is if there is a crisis with Russia militarily and the UK military is seen to be failing in its task. The opposite of the Thatcher Falklands effect, if you like. The citizens will forgive politicians' neglect of the military for a long time until it's needed. And we saw, you remember this with the snatched Land Rovers, and the lack of helicopters in Afghanistan. Nobody really cared about military spending until, even in a relatively unpopular war that frankly didn't really matter for our own, daily defense and security in the UK, the public were absolutely outraged when we didn't have the right kit and when soldiers were sent in, in inadequate equipment, with inadequate care. And so, it's a very, very strong bet that there will absolutely not be a requirement for the UK to play a significant role in the defense of Europe over the next 5 years, to not fund these core capabilities required, and to not force through the really hard choices and retiring some capabilities in order to pay for the core and making that work.